Hello there. We're going to be talking today about Native American regions and the climate that they had there. So we know that about 40,000 years ago in North America, we had hundreds of Native American tribes just about that were making their way across the land bridge into North America from Asia. Now, after several thousand years, the Ice Age occurred, the peak of the Ice Age occurred, and then you had the melting of ice, the receding of ice, moving back to the Arctic Circle. And then what happened, you had a lot more land that was available that was no longer covered by ice. So what happens next? You have Native Americans that were now looking for new lands, okay? And so they would migrate into different regions of what we now call the United States of America. And then it was just Native America. I mean, no one had staked claim to it except for individual tribes scattered throughout North America. So let's get started. So in the very northern part of the globe, you have something called the Arctic. You have tribes such as the Inuit that lived there, and it was very, very cold for most of the year, and you could expect a lot of snow. Now, in the subarctic, which is below the tree line, which is a part, it's an area of land, it's a landform where it's so cold where trees cannot grow. That is in the Arctic region, but in the subarctic, that's a little bit lower than that. You can expect a little bit more regulated temperatures. It's not frozen and cold all of the time, but you can expect a lot of cold. So Native Americans had to adapt, and then they would try to find furs throughout the season to meet their needs for food, clothing, and shelter. They would hunt caribou, elk, animals in that area that could meet their immediate needs. Next, let's move all the way to the northeast. If you're in New York, say, what's up? What's up? All right, people in New York, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, the climate in that particular area was temperate, which meant that you had 4 distinct seasons. You had winter, spring, summer, and fall. And everyone was very pronounced, and you knew exactly what season it was when it was there. In winter, you could expect snow. You could expect that it was going to be very cold. And so you would, like the animals that were around them, such as the bears and elk and deer, they would find shelter for the winter, or they would hibernate, whatever the case was. But in the spring, you could see a lot of development, a lot of growth with new plants. Summertime, it was warm. And then in the fall, it cooled off a little bit, but it was temperate. The word temperate pretty much means expected, or when you think of the 4 seasons, they're very pronounced, so you know exactly what they are. Now, let's move down to the southeast. Whoop, whoop. This is where I'm at in the state of Georgia. Now, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, even into North Carolina. It was warm and hot, but the seasons were temperate, just like the Northeast. You had pronounced seasons. Summers were hot. Winters were not as cold as in the Northeast, but they're still pretty cold. You could expect some snow, but not as much as you would see in the Northeast. In the Great Plains region, where tribes like the Pawnee lived, you'd have millions, at this time, millions of buffalo roaming, but it was very dry. The land was very flat, but the climate was more temperate than what you'd see in the Arctic, where it was predictably cold most of the time. But in the plains, you could expect drought in the summertime, where you do not see a lot of precipitation. The grass would dry up and food would not become as plentiful. But in the wintertime, it would get really cold, it would snow. But in the fall and spring, that's where you would have a lot of plants, and they would start domesticating vegetables and fruits that they could grow, and then they could start using farming as a method of providing some of their needs for food, clothing, and shelter. Whereas many of the tribes relied on hunting and gathering. They would gather roots, bulbs, seeds. They would collect these things, and what they would do, they would store them for later. They started learning preservation techniques, but they relied heavily on the buffalo in the Great Plains, and so they used the buffalo for just about all of their needs, and they used every bit of the buffalo. They didn't waste anything. One of the greatest things about Native Americans is that they were very in tune with the environment, and they were the very first environmentalists. You can think that you're reducing, reusing, and recycling all you're wanting, and you're changing the world. Well, Native Americans were doing that a lot longer than you were. So, in the Southwest, it was warm, it was hot, it was dry. Parts of it are considered desert. They receive very little precipitation throughout the year. But just like I've been saying throughout the course of these videos, Native Americans are extremely intelligent. They knew how to work the land, and because it is warm and hot in the southwest right here, and it was dry and it was a desert, well, you know what? They knew where rivers were. They could divert them, and they could actually irrigate, which means to water a lot of the plants that they were domesticating. So they were expert farmers, whereas they didn't have to rely on hunting as much because the animals weren't quite there. They would hunt jackrabbits and deer if they would find their way there, but they relied heavily on farming because they became expert farmers when they domesticated plants, and they could learn how to irrigate properly. Okay, in the Great Basin area, this is in Nevada, Utah. It's a Great Bowl. It's temperate, which means you have 4 distinct seasons: winter, spring, summer, and fall. They're very pronounced. You know what they are. But some areas, heading into Death Valley in California, it gets extremely dry. I was actually there this summer, and Death Valley is fundamentally miserable. You're looking at approximately 120 degrees at 6 p.m. It's dry. There's no humidity, so there's not a lot of moisture. It just depends where you're at in the Great Basin with the Cascade Mountains there, and it really depends on your elevation. Next, in California, I put varied here, and the reason why, because California is a very interesting state. It's very diverse in terms of geography. In San Francisco, whereas San Francisco wasn't there 40,000 years ago, the area there is just like a natural air conditioner, and because you have fog billowing in from the Pacific Ocean, and it's very cool, and it stays cool most of the year. So you have some temperate climates there. You also have what they consider Mediterranean climates, where you see olives being grown, but that was brought later on. But it has the kind of climate where it's dry, but you use the precipitation when it comes to your advantage. So they would store water, and they would try to irrigate as they could. Now, in the Plateau region, which is in the high country in the United States, near the Pacific Northwest, in Idaho, and into Washington and in that area, but it was temperate, which, you see this very commonly throughout the United States. The biggest theme is when you look at these Native American tribes, you got to know that in the United States, generally, unless you're in the American Southwest, it's going to be very temperate, a little bit hotter in the Southeast. But the next part I'm going to talk about, the Pacific Northwest coast, these are tribes such as the Tlingit and the Kwakiutl and the Kawakawakawa. Now, these Native Americans, it was the seasons were very temperate. You could expect winter, spring, summer, and fall, but it was very rainy as well. And what that means is that they had to use the materials they had around them, which were cedar trees, to their advantage. And since cedar bark is waterproof, well, guess what? A lot of their clothing, they use their environment, such as the bark, such as the planks from cedar, and they would build plank houses that would keep out insects, would try to keep out precipitation, moisture, and would give them a relatively comfortable living. So that pretty much wraps up Native American climates and regions. Booyah.